Welcome, future lawyers, to BarMax, the best in bar exam prep. We are excited to bring you another free webinar today, this one on securing accommodations for the bar exam and knowing when you need them. The second part's important because there are people who've succeeded in law school and in life up until now who, because of their disability, will require an accommodation on the bar exam itself. And these can be physical disabilities, learning differences, processing difficulties. The bar exam poses unique demands that may need accommodation, and you have every right to them under law if you have such a condition. So it's something you want to think about, even if you haven't used accommodations in law school. And if you have used accommodations in law school, you know that that was a process. And this is a process too of getting the accommodations that you need secured. And it may be more detailed, more difficult, and require more testing, more documentation, more time than law school accommodations did. So because of that, you want a really seasoned guide to help you along the way. And that would be our very own Lavanya Sabin. She has been teaching law students for, I think we're coming up on decades now, but especially she began working with law students with disabilities and helping them to secure their accommodations. So she is a bar exam tutor with us, but she also helps students in this unique, special capacity. Now, for everything else you need for the bar exam, we have comprehensive courses that offer, of course, lectures and flashcards, but most importantly, all of the real released past bar exam questions available. We have all of the real released MBE questions, those multiple choice questions that are licensed and available. And you will get those with BarMax. You'll get all of the past essays and performance tests and a study calendar to help you kind of select which ones to do and when to do them as you move forward in your studying. When you study with BarMax, you can begin at any time. We do not have a period of time in which you purchased it, but you're locked out until the course starts. You have the course from the moment you buy it up until you pass the bar. So that's an advantage. If you are not successful that first time taking the bar and you need to come back to us and say, hey, I need to keep my access open, we will not charge you extra for that. You can stay with us for another exam administration at that price I just showed you and pass the bar that way. If you are already a BarMax student and think you might want Lavanya or another BarMax tutor working with you through the process, then you may want to consider BarMax tutoring. And of course, we offer bundles for those of you who want to just dive in and purchase both at once. If you are not yet a BarMax student and you know you want the program and tutoring, buy it all up front in a bundle and save money that way. You can get in touch with us through our website, which I'm going to leave on the screen here for a moment, so that you can go look it up and bookmark it. But so you can reach out to us through that website, or you can also call us, or you can download our free BarMax app. Now, obviously, to unlock all the content in that app, you have to pay for our access, but you can look at part of the content to kind of see what we look like and how the app works. We've been a very highly rated app for a long time. We did not just invent an online course when COVID happened. We've been online all along. So we have a very wonderful and high rated app. If you go look in the App Store, it's been 4.9 stars or something like that for a very long time. And we're very proud of that. So it's a good product to use. Download the free version, get to know us, and then either contact us through the website or the app, or by giving us a call and letting us know how we can help you achieve your dream of becoming a lawyer. And with that, I bring you Lavanya.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our presentation today about securing accommodations and if you need them. I am Lavanya Sabin. I'm one of the tutors for BarMax. I have been tutoring for way too many years, about 20 years or more. And one of the specialties I deal with is students who need accommodations. Just to give you a little background, I started in the accommodation sector before I ever became a tutor, working with law students that needed accommodations. And based on that, I actually became really interested in various challenges that people have in taking the bar exam. So welcome. I'm going to have a little presentation here. I'm going to go through a PowerPoint, and I'm going to also give you an opportunity to ask any questions. Let's see. Let me share my screen here. Get this up. Okay. Hold on. Hope everyone can see this. There's no issue. Okay, securing accommodations for the bar exam, and in parentheses, and knowing when you need them. That sometimes is half of the battle. Okay, today we're just going to look at the process for securing accommodations, which includes applying for accommodations, issues that perhaps retakers might have, and the appeals process. I'm also going to answer some commonly asked questions I've gotten over the years, and of course, any specific questions you might have tonight. I want to emphasize to you that this is general information. You really need to check with your specific jurisdiction about what their requirements are. Every jurisdiction is different. It has a lot of similarities, which we'll touch upon tonight, but they do have different forms and different things for you to complete. So typical documentation kind of falls in 4 categories. So we have the actual petition or the application, verification forms, the history of your accommodations, and any additional supporting documentation. Now, with regard to the petition / application, that is something that is form that's provided to you by the bar examiners, and you have to complete their form. That is typical for most jurisdictions. There's usually a section that has to be completed by your medical provider. So you'll get a whole packet, and then there's your application and a bunch of other things you need to complete. Just be aware that applications are not always available online. In many jurisdictions, I found you have to actually call the office and ask one to be sent to you. And sometimes that's only by regular mail, so snail mail. Take that into account when you're trying to time everything. It can take a bit of a while to get to you. If it's filed online, the examiners can ask you to submit the originals at a later date. So obviously keep a file going of everything that you need and stay super organized. The application is usually filed separately from your bar exam application. That means it's usually going to a different address. Make note of that and send it to the correct place. I have had people who sent it to the wrong place. You have to include all the necessary documentation. Do not send stuff in piecemeal. Make sure you have a nice, beautiful, complete package to send to them that tells your whole story and asks for what you want. If there are required forms that aren't complete, the application usually won't get processed. That can be really tough if you're coming close to the deadline, because usually once that deadline is done, you can't submit anything new. You can oftentimes file your accommodations petition before you file your actual bar exam application, but like nothing gets processed until you're in their system. So you have to get registered, which is usually what happens with the bar exam application that gets you all registered. But you can get the ball rolling a lot sooner than you might have anticipated. Okay, the next thing is verification forms. Sometimes there's different verification forms for different disabilities. So for example, physical disabilities as opposed to learning disabilities, as opposed to psychological disabilities. And sometimes there's a general form. I know in California that there are actually different verification forms for different types of disabilities. What you do is you take this verification form to your provider, and you usually have to fill out the front part with your information and then turn that form into your provider for that person to complete the rest. They'll need to complete it, sign it, and then return it to you so you can go ahead and put it as part of your package that you're sending in. It is really, really important. I can't emphasize this enough. It's really important the provider understand the format and the time requirements for the bar exam, and that they specifically address what your needs are in relation to that. A lot of providers have, they know about the SAT or the LSAT, but they don't really understand the bar exam. So you really need to be able to explain to them, hey, this is what the format is. This is how it works. I did notice recently on the California forms, it's really nice because on the verification form, there is an explanation to the provider. They're in a rush. They have a lot going on. Make sure they read it, or you verbally tell them that. Okay. Now, you're going to need a history of your accommodations if you have it. Some people don't, and that's okay. It's not a deal breaker. But if you do have it, make sure that you go ahead, find it, dig it up, go back to the schools or your old providers and get the documentation. That should be all past testing as far back as you possibly can go. You can include stuff like your individual education plan, otherwise known as an IEP, a 504 plan, a grant of a law school of accommodations, or documentation of accommodations you received for the bar exam, perhaps in another jurisdiction. Sometimes this might require the last two, the law school and the prior jurisdiction. Sometimes there's actually a separate form they have to complete. You have to, again, fill out the front, send it to them, have them fill it out and send it back to you. Just keep that in mind with regard to timing. I did have an instance once when one of the law schools had actually closed and the student couldn't get the law school letter completed. He just explained to the bar examiners what had happened, and it didn't seem to present a problem. But you have to, if you can get it, then you should get it. The documentation typically needs to identify the time frame you received the accommodations, like, for example, 3 years of law school, the type of disability, and the accommodations that were provided or that were denied. You need to provide typically all of that information. Now, supporting documentation. You should submit any documentation that will support your application. Remember, they only see what you submit. And for first-time applicants, it's really important that the documentation be current. I would say usually within 1 to 5 years of the testing date. That's a good rule of thumb. But again, check with your jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions really want it within 1 year of your testing date. And some, I think I was taking a look at California, they sort of have a little bit more time available. It has to come from a qualified professional in the field, and that means different things in different jurisdictions. For example, some jurisdictions only accept a psychiatrist's documentation, and they won't accept a psychologist's documentation, and some jurisdictions just don't care. Some states require you, like California, require you to also do a personal narrative. It basically describes your disability, how it impacts your academic, professional, and or personal life. It's not extensive. It sounds a little scary, but it's not as difficult, I think, as it seems. Before we go on to specific disabilities, with regard to your documentation overall, I would ask you to remember that you are now, if you haven't been in practice, then you are your first client. You need to make the very best case that you can. That means completing everything that they have for you to complete, but also making sure that you provide as much documentation as possible. The last thing the bar examiners want to do is get sued for not providing somebody the accommodations that are required by law for them to provide. So the better you make that case, the more likely you are to secure those accommodations. So don't be half-hearted, it is a scary, long process sometimes, but if it's what you need, then you kind of have to fight for it. With regard to learning disabilities, usually a letter from a provider is just not enough. You're going to need some additional testing. These are called like psychoeducational assessments, depending on what your learning disability is. It usually needs a detailed diagnostic report with it. It needs to address the current impact of the disability on the specific elements of the bar exam. For example, issues like, do you have issues with time? Do you have problems sitting for long periods of time? Do you need breaks? Do you need limited distractions, like too many people in the room and too many people getting up and down, you need a smaller room? Has the disability changed in severity or manifested in a different way? And do you need medication for it? Do you have to stop to take the medication? Remember, they're not going to stop the clock for you. So if you have to take lots of breaks, you really need to build that into your extra time that you're requesting. Qualified professionals include these various licensed people. Again, it depends on your jurisdiction. Clinical or educational psychologist, neuropsychologist, educational diagnosticians, learning disability specialists, and educational therapists. Not all of them are accepted in all jurisdictions. So be really careful about who you're getting your testing with. I will tell you, and this is from personal experience, not just from bar experience, but with my own children, that testing is expensive. So if you're getting testing for the first time, you really need to plan for that from a financial perspective. Also, it can take a while to find a qualified professional. Sometimes they're not as available in your area as you would like. And also, it can take a while to get an appointment. So plan ahead, plan. That's the key here. With regard to ADD and ADHD, which is learning disabilities, and ADD and ADHD are the ones I see most commonly when I'm tutoring students. It's a little bit different in that you'll need documentation such as evaluation reports, test results, history of medication, and it's good to have like when the initial diagnosis was done, how old were you, what was the date for that. If it's not something you recognized or had since you were a little child, or just It hasn't really come up except now in the bar exam situation. I have had that happen actually quite a few times, that it was something that developed after law school. And then it's not, again, not a deal breaker if you haven't had it and didn't recognize it from a very young age. Self-reporting is considered, like if you're just telling your provider about yourself, it's considered, but it can't usually be the sole basis for the evaluation. Typically, there has to be some other type of testing involved. If you can, if it is possible, then showing a history of ADD or ADHD seems to be in a lot of jurisdictions quite important for this type of disability. Qualified professionals, they have to be licensed and typically have, let's say, about 3 years, at least 3 years of working with adults, not just exclusively with children. So those can be clinical psychologists, neuropsychologists, and psychiatrists. Okay, physical disabilities. I've had a number of students with physical disabilities over the years. You will need medical records, evaluation reports, testing documentation. You need the qualified professional, whoever that might have provided your professional group that provides your medical care, who did the assessments or have recently done the assessments of your physical disability. The documentation really has to address the need for the accommodations in relation to the current bar exam, the format and so forth. If you have old documentation, it will need to be updated with current diagnosis and current level of function, and the rationale for the accommodation in relation to what's required on the bar exam. I will note, I've had students with who've been in wheelchairs, for example, and it wasn't until they started practicing and really doing the timed elements of the exam and practicing that they realized that sitting for long periods of time were a problem, that this was sitting longer than they had normally expected. So those things do come up. Please, please just, try to keep it in mind, all the things that you might need, because when you get close to the exam, you won't have another shot at asking for additional accommodations. I have also had students with visual disabilities, and sometimes that requires a lot of more specific information, a lot of testing, acuity, and so on. That's because they need to figure out if you need everything printed in larger text, or if they need to find someone who's going to be a reader or a typist, if you need voice to text software. So just make sure that you follow and provide the information to them that you need. I know in California, there's actually a separate verification form for visual disabilities. So keep that in mind. It doesn't just get clumped under physical disabilities. Psychological disabilities. These are the disabilities I see a lot of times that students might have had them in law school, but a lot of times it's something that might arise after law school, before they take the bar exam, or someone who's a retaker, and then something happens. And so a lot of times tend to be things that have come up more recently. The type of documentation you need is a specific diagnosis, or if it's still not exactly sure, if there could be various things, a differential diagnosis. Oftentimes you actually need the provider to provide some sort of diagnostic code. You did a current clinical assessment with a description of the testing techniques used, as well as what kind of functional limitations. I would say with psychological disabilities, like kind of like ADD and ADHD, it really is critical, super critical, that your documentation is recent. So get in there with the provider, get that stuff updated, make sure that you have everything up to date as possible. The report typically has to be comprehensive. So what does that mean? It usually has to have a clinical, developmental, educational, and family history, sort of the frequency of the disability, the intensity, the duration, the sort of limitations, and a little bit different than a lot of disabilities, the compliance with medication and treatment. It is all very invasive, and you do have to, but unfortunately, you do have to get all that documentation together and submit it to them to make a really good case. Qualified professionals can include psychologists. Again, like I said earlier, some states won't accept a psychologist report or a psychiatrist, both of whom would have to be licensed. This is probably the most critical element I can tell you about, which is timing. You have to pay super, super close attention to the deadline date. Do not miss that date. Get the application, figure out what the deadline date is, and plan about 4 to 6 months out from that date, because especially if you don't have a lot of your documentation in place yet. You can usually file, like I said, before the exam, but make sure that you have it all complete. It can take a while. So it can take like at least 60 days, depending on your jurisdiction, to get a response on whether you've secured accommodations or not. I've had lots of people 4 weeks out, 5 weeks out from the exam, still haven't heard. And they get really, really nervous. So I'm assuming that if you file it earlier, you will hear earlier. I'm not sure if it always works that way, but it always seems people are very anxious about getting the accommodations response back. You also really need to leave yourself enough time before the exam to respond to, like if they want the originals, or if they want some additional documentation. Also, you have to leave yourself enough time for the appeal, because you don't want to be doing that, 2 weeks before the exam or 3 weeks before the exam. You want to leave yourself enough time that if that does come up, okay, you can handle it and it'll be fine. Unfortunately, in my experience, a lot of times, it does come down to sort of 6 weeks before the exam or 8 weeks before the exam when you're studying. And it's a lot to juggle. Just be aware of that and, just take it one step at a time. Types of accommodations. The most important thing is that your provider state what specific accommodations you need. If I've had somebody whose provider said, oh, you really need an hour and a half addition, really need time and a half. But maybe if we give you time and we say time and a quarter, they'll be more likely to give it to you. Don't do that. Make sure you get the time that you need, the accommodation that you specifically need to be successful on the exam. Don't try to think, oh, what are they thinking, or what will they actually grant me? Just ask for what you need, stick with it, document it, and move forward. Because if you need it, if you need time and a half, that's what you need to be successful. And you really don't know what's going through their minds. What are the kind of common accommodations that are available? Usually additional time, that's typically time and a half. But I have seen in certain circumstances double time. Very rarely, it's usually time and a half. So I had one state last time that said time and a quarter and then changed it to time and a half. It was very strange. But that's typically what you're getting. Extended testing schedule. I've actually not had anyone ask for this, though I've heard through the grapevine that you can. just understand different jurisdictions have different schedules for accommodated exams. I know that in the past, Oregon has given their exam, like for the UBE in Oregon, they've given the exam in 2 very long days. That makes a big difference because your medication has to last all day, your concentration, your ability to sit, and so on. If it's 2 long days and perhaps you have a disability that can't handle, those long sessions over 4 hours long each, then yeah, an extended testing schedule is something you need to consider and ask for. Now, in other states, like in South Carolina, they give the exam over, or have given the exam over a 4-day period. So it's the UBE state as well. So one element of the UBE every day, and only 4.5 hours if you had double time each day. So just understand how your jurisdiction, if you can find that information, find out. And if you need an extended testing schedule, then go ahead and ask for it. There are other accommodations like separate room for testing or a quiet room. Typically, you're in a room with a small number of other students who are taking the exam with accommodations. I have seen in the past somebody who had their own room. That is a possibility in some jurisdictions. And I've also had one I didn't put down here, but placement in the room. I've had people who really can't watch other people. It's very distracting. So they need to face a wall or something like that where they don't have all that visual distraction. Customized testing material. I have come across this with the Braille and the large print. Permission to bring medication. It depends on the jurisdiction what they allow you to bring in, usually in a nice little clear plastic bag of some sort. But you have to check with them if medication is allowed. If not, you're going to have to ask for that as an accommodation if you need it. Wheelchair access seems like they should have this, but a lot of times it can be super inconvenient, or I don't know, maybe they haven't thought about it. I know there's some old buildings where the exam has been given in some of the smaller states. Permission to dictate to a typist, usually for visual disabilities. And then here's one which has come up recently with COVID and taking the exam remotely. When you take the exam on ExamSoft, like during COVID, they didn't allow scratch paper except for one, and the UBE except for one for the MPT. And there was no hard copy of the exam. I have found, especially people with learning disabilities and ADD, ADHD, that a hard copy is really, really critical to their success. I've seen people take it purely on the MBE purely on the computer, and then taken the same exam with a hard copy, and the difference sometimes is 10 or 15 percentage points. So I really think with the advent of COVID and the more remote testing, it is important, if you need a hard copy, you need to ask for a hard copy. A lot of people need to scratch up the piece of paper, use their own marks and so on. And I think it makes a big difference it can make a big difference on your performance. Appeals. So it sounds scary, but actually the twice it's gone, it's not been as scary as I thought, that I've dealt with it with students. You usually appeal if there's been, like, you've been totally denied or partially denied or modified from your provider's recommendation. Like I said, I had somebody who asked for time and a half and got time and a quarter, and then was about to appeal it, and I don't know, the state changed their mind and sent them another letter and said, oh no, it's time and a half. And no state wants to get sued over these things. Remember that. The jurisdiction can request updated information if there's an appeal. And then with the appeal, again, you may not find out shortly before the exam. I've had appeals where it's just sending in the documentation, and I've had an appeal where it was actually a call to the student and she could also have her someone there with her. And I've sat there in that appeal. They asked questions for about 5 to 7 minutes and then said, fine, here's your accommodations. So what seemed really scary was not that big of a deal in the end. But it can be stressful and overwhelming. So, take that into account. If you're a retaker and you got accommodations on the first time you took the bar exam and you didn't pass, you usually don't need new documentation. If you're like asking for the same accommodations and it's based on like a permanent disability and not an emergency disability is like if you broke your leg or your arm. Believe it or not, also falling in that category is if you're pregnant or if you just gave birth and you need to breastfeed and so on. In some jurisdictions, that's the case. So if it's a permanent disability, then typically you're not providing more new documentation. Now, there is the caveat that if you took the exam and then like 4 years later decided, 5 years later or 6 years later decided to take it again, then you need to check with your jurisdiction on whether that documentation is still going to be good. Okay, do I have any questions before I ask about questions? Anybody? Do you have questions? Let's see, chat.
There are some questions in the Q&A. Sorry.
Oh, here it is. I'm looking at the wrong thing. Let's see. What if you don't have a history? Can you use what can you use to show history? Yeah, you don't have a history, so you have nothing to show a history. And that's fine. I have seen that happen before. Just make sure your documentation is from your provider is really good and complete, that you have all the testing and so forth, and go with that. Sometimes a transcript helps, but that's not a really good indication, because sometimes you just learn to work around the disability. Again, just complete information, current information in relation to the exam now. Common reasons an accommodation gets denied. That is because it wasn't filed on time, or the documentation is scant or incomplete. Those are the real reasons they get denied. Does a provider who provides the medical diagnosis have to be your provider for a certain period of time? Not that I know of. I mean, I've had people, be in law school and then move to another city and gotten a new provider. I've never seen that being an issue. And really, though, if you have if you have other records from a provider from another city or so on, make sure that you get that, as much information as possible. Are anxiety-related disorders treated differently than intellectual disabilities? Learning disabilities, anxiety, I mean, they just fall under different categories. So one would be psychological disabilities, the anxiety, and the learning disabilities or ADHD would be, they're different categories. I have found a lot of times they go hand in hand. So make sure you get documentation for both. I mean, I talked about them all separately, all these disabilities separately, but obviously a lot of them are related to each other. I have lots of students who have physical disabilities, who have anxiety as well, or who have very, very commonly ADHD and anxiety. So just make sure that both of them are really well documented. They're not treated differently. You just have to document both. Okay. Are you aware of any situations where someone with a hearing disability was granted accommodations? Let me think. I haven't. Doesn't mean I won't in the future. But definitely, I mean, there's lots of things I've heard. I mean, obviously, a lot of things that are available. I just haven't dealt with them personally. How can you contact me? Through BarMax. I'm a BarMax tutor. So that's how you can reach out to BarMax, and then we can go from there. Could testing at a site closer to where I live be considered an accommodation? Or maybe something else might be reasonable to ask for. Travel, especially overnight travel, is an obstacle for me. Yeah, absolutely. Like, for example, I know in New York, there's so many different testing sites. Some of them are in Manhattan, but they're usually for people who live in New York City. And then there's, of course, Albany. And yeah, you should ask for what you need. So if that's something that you need, you definitely can ask for it. Sometimes they'll just assign you to a site, and then you can ask for it to be changed. But yeah, I would definitely explain why it's problematic. Is a Veterans Administration disability diagnosis sufficient evidence, or will you still recommend getting a comprehensive and current? I would say current diagnostic exam for sure, as comprehensive as you can have it, and closer in time to the bar exam when you're taking the exam is really critical. Anyway, you'll have to give those verification forms to a provider and have them fill them out. So that's a good time to discuss exactly where your documentation is at this time. Really depends on the date of that disability diagnosis. If it's just a diagnosis, that's by, I know what you mean, by the VA, it can be just 1 or 2 pages. You really need something more comprehensive than that, I would think, though I haven't dealt with it personally. Okay, here's my commonly asked questions. Let's see. I'm going to put this over in the corner here. Yeah. Okay. See if I can get this going again. Do I need accommodations? So the second part of this presentation is like, how do I know when I need accommodations? These are typically things that I have seen that sort of ring some alarm bells for me. It's not comprehensive, but over the years, these are the types, when I start to see some of these things, I start asking questions. So first of all, a history of accommodations in any part of your education. I have a lot of people who are like, well, when I was a kid in elementary school, I got diagnosed with ADD, but after that, in high school and college and law school, really never pursued it. Well, the bar exam is a strange creature, and it can bring up a lot of those things. So that's something you should just kind of look at. Do you have trouble with any part of the exam? So yes, I'm not talking, you all have trouble at the beginning because we don't know anything, and it takes a lot of time to learn the information. But for example, especially if you're a retaker and you've studied a lot and you really can't finish sections even after having studying for quite some time, that's really a red flag to me. I always ask a few more questions. Do you have trouble memorizing large amounts of information, just retaining the information, getting through the information? Does it take you, 3 times as long as your buddy to just memorize or get through the information? One thing I didn't put in here also, I should have, was a lot of times when people have a lot of trouble listening to lectures for long periods of time, like they're listening to it, but it's not really absorbing in their mind. They can't really focus on it for a long time. Sometimes that's something that I have question marks about. Do you have a slow reading speed? Do you have sort of panic, this overwhelming panic during the exam or while you're practicing, where I'm not talking about, we all have panic about the bar exam, but I'm more talking about like really debilitating, like you just can't move forward, you can't think straight, you just completely freeze up. Okay. That's something to be taken care of. I also talk to you about, I just said about a retaker who's like failed the exam numerous times, even after they've intensely studied. 99.9% of the time, I work with people, retakers, who have studied very, very hard and spent a lot of time studying and memorizing. And so it's typically not like they haven't studied. It's typically that they have actually studied harder than most everyone around them, but still can't seem to pass the exam. Some of that, yes, is what you study, how you study, but some of that could be the ability to process and retain information. And that's something to think about. Has there been a recent accident or development after law school? This happens, like the question that I got from recently. It does happen. And a lot of people don't realize that they have certain types of disabilities, social learning disabilities or ADHD or psychological disabilities until they're faced with this very high pressure environment. This is a question answered earlier. Can I get accommodations if I did not get them in law school? Yes, it's possible to get accommodations if you didn't get them during law school. Like I said, it could be something that you've never seen before. You need very robust documentation. That's the key. And it seems to be that securing some accommodations for some disabilities, at least in my experience, is a little easier than others. That's not saying that you can't, because I have seen it happen before. Do I need accommodations for the bar exam if I did well in law school without them? So this goes for the person who perhaps had accommodations, like I said, in elementary school or high school, even college, even maybe for law school, but really never needed them. Just was great without them, always finished in time, never had really an issue. But it was a personal decision whether you want to apply for accommodations. I just want you to keep this in mind, is the bar exam is different from the exams in law school. It is very long and it is very driven by time. Everything is timed. I mean, when we practice, we know exactly how many minutes you need for each MBE question. Exactly at the time for when I work with people for the MPT, it's like this much time for this part, this much time for the next part. So it's very time driven. It has a very specific format. It's not like your law school exams where you may have a take-home paper, an open book exam, or just multiple choice. It has, various different elements to it. It is a high pressure, high stakes environment. The pressure builds up in all the months before when you're studying for it. There's a lot of people besides you who've given up a lot of your time and money and effort. So you've got all that pressure on you. And then you've got the exam and the exam day itself. So just keep that in mind. It requires mastery of very large bodies of information with very little preparation time. If you're taking it right out of law school, you really got 2 months or something like that for the UB is like 14 topics. It's a lot of topics. Yeah, you've had the class before, but like 3 years ago and not in this format. So, And you have to move through the information pretty quickly. Now, one of the things, and that's why I tutor, one of the reasons I tutor for BarMax, one of the things I like about our program is that it can be tailored to the specific needs of a student. So a lot of times I've sat down and said, okay, we need to like break down the schedule into smaller pieces. We need to rearrange it like this. And I've in private bar tutoring, these are the kinds of things I can do and work with students on. It is all closed book. Like there, you have to memorize it all. So that's something to think about. And the other thing is, unlike a sliding scale exam, like you could make an A or B or C, or, you get a higher or lower SAT score. It really is a hard line in the sand. Like you either make the score that passes or you fail. And that is a lot of pressure. So something to really think about when you think about, do I need to really secure those accommodations that were granted to me before? I would definitely look into it. Will the fact I got accommodations be marked on my bar record? I get this often. I don't know if I want to apply it'll be on there and maybe it won't look good for me in my professional career. I have never, ever seen this hamper any of my students' legal careers. No, your bar license does not come with a note that you took the exam with accommodations. No, the results are not posted with any notation that you took the exam with accommodations. Really, my experience has been that the records regarding the accommodations for the exam are really kept separate from the actual bar documentation and application. That's usually why you're sending it to two completely separate offices. And the evaluators who are evaluating your need for accommodations are not the same people who are evaluating your fitness to take the bar exam or sit for the exam. Will taking the exam with accommodations affect my scoring negatively? So a lot of students are like, well, maybe I shouldn't do it because they'll look at me and think, oh, I had it easier because I had accommodated time, and then they'll, grade me more harshly or so on. As far as I know, all exam answers are blind graded. It's just a number. And I have never, ever heard of the accommodated exams being graded separately or in a somehow notated or anything like that. I think what just happens is they get all the answers and they pile them all together and they're not segregated in any way. Never known. I mean, obviously I don't know all the system, but I've just never known that to be an issue. I think that would be a red flag for, lawsuits. So I doubt that happens. Oh, this is a question. Will other people see that I'm getting accommodations on exam day? This is, oftentimes, I know when I took the bar exam, a lot of my friends were taking it in that jurisdiction, and they were all meeting in the beforehand, waiting for the doors to open, get registered, and so on. So no, usually students take the exam in completely separate rooms from the general test takers because their time will be different and they may need a quieter room. They may not, like I said, not be facing other people. You can't take the exam with 1,600 other people if you get super distracted from your ADHD. So typically they're in separate rooms. And also, in a lot of places, I know this in South Carolina, there's actually a separate entrance to these rooms. And in some places, actually, it's administered in a completely separate building. So never had anybody been embarrassed or have any issue with that in the past. Okay, just to summarize, start preparing early, like 4 to 6 months early if you can. Okay, locate and get the application. It sounds like it should be easy in this day and age, but believe it or not, it's harder than it seems in some places. Find out the deadline date for your jurisdiction. That is number one importance. Make sure you make appointments with your providers as soon as possible, because as you know, it takes a while sometimes to get that appointment. Make sure your document is up to date. Collect as much of your historical information, if it's available, as possible. That might have you calling a bunch of different places trying to get it all, including, you know, a parent. So make sure you get in touch with everyone. Please make sure that all your forms are there, and then make sure that you've provided everything that's required in one nice, neat package. Have a checklist, check it off, check it again, and make sure it's all there. Otherwise, they'll probably just send the whole thing back to you. Get any forms that are required to be completed by your law school to them as early as possible. And this is really one of the biggest issues people have. Have enough resources planned for that to pay for any additional testing, medication, or provider visits as needed. One of the biggest barriers to getting all of this done is really the resources. I have had people who are veterans look to the VA and other state resources. I've had other people also look to the Department of Labor for some of in their state to get some of their documentation done. It was a long process, but they did get it done at a very reasonable cost. So there's a lot of resources in your state. If you know, paying for it out of pocket is a problem, make sure you do the research for that. And again, please, this is all just general information and from my personal experience, but please check with your specific jurisdiction to see what you need and what is required, because every jurisdiction is different. And it is critical you know what they're looking for. Let me go to the Q&A again, see what other questions you have. Let me go, where did I go? Okay. So I was denied accommodations the first time I took the bar and appealed. I had accommodations for the LSAT and during law school due to ADD, but my jurisdiction denied them when I applied and also denied my appeal. Can you offer me any advice? It's hard for me to do that in a vacuum. That's really unusual that they would do that. I think you'd have to really know the state as well as kind of what was required. Are we sure that everything was there, that it was up to date and current? That, you know, again, you're making a case, so you want to make sure that you want to make sure that you definitely have everything in order. It's hard for me to do that. I just haven't heard of that happening before. So sorry, I can't provide more information on that. Let's see what else we got here. What do we have? What are some common accommodations that someone who experiences panic attacks during the bar exam might find helpful? Really additional time. Usually it depends on what brings on the panic attacks, but sometimes it's the time, the very tight time frame that really can be difficult. So breaks as well as accommodated time, the ability to take accommodations, take medication, sorry. Sometimes the extended the extended exam schedule instead of taking 2 long days, being able to take it like in 4 days. Okay. I have a diagnostic by a certified psychologist from 3 years ago. Submitted my accommodation request a few weeks ago, received notice my application was incomplete, required more information. They're asking for a current report, someone who knows me well. Yeah, and can attest to my disability limits by everyday life, not just test taking scenarios. Is this standard? How comprehensive should this report be? I have heard of that before for certain types of disabilities. So is it standard? Nothing standard because every jurisdiction is different. But I have heard it been asked before. So you do need to provide it. How comprehensive? As comprehensive as you can make it. As detailed, and make sure that the details, if you can, somehow relate back to the requirements of the exam. You want to show how your disability is, why you need accommodations because of the specific parameters of the bar exam. I have memory issues. I can't remember anything after I've read it. I can't remember simple words. What kind of accommodations could I get? That's really up to your provider. I don't know what specific things you could get, but I would definitely talk to your provider of that. Let's see. I'm switching providers soon. Would a phone call be sufficient, or do I need to have an appointment with them if they're no longer my provider? They're hard to work with. If they're no longer your provider, you need to just you could talk to them, but you definitely need to get all your historical information, so all your medical records from them. That can take a while, so plan ahead. If they're hard to work with, they'll probably drag their feet. So, but just make sure you get all your medical records from them. That's what I would recommend. And then get updated documentation from your new provider. Board of Admissions hires an out-of-state person to evaluate my records. And he said, in his opinion, I wasn't entitled to them. Interesting. Really, I haven't even heard of that, so I don't really know what to say. I mean, I would still do your if you need the accommodations, I would go ahead and still get all the documentation that's required, plus some, making sure it's very complete, and then go ahead and submit it. I mean, he has his opinion, but you don't know what might happen. I'm an Illinois resident who will be taking the California bar. Can I ask for accommodations to take the test here instead of flying, which brings extreme anxiety? I don't know. You could ask, but I would be very surprised. But you never know. Now, pre-COVID, I'd say, well, you can't do that because it wasn't given online, but things have changed now. I don't really know the answer to that question. You definitely could ask about that, but and see what they say. Are there any other questions? Okay. Oh, sorry. One more here. I'm visually impaired. I plan on taking the California exam as a normal person would if I were need accommodations after an successful attempt. Does the I assume if you ask them for large print, I have had visually impaired students, not in California, but in other states, get large print exam materials. I would tell you that if you need the accommodation, try to get it for every administration that you're planning to take. It's not great to work that hard, and it's a lot of work to get ready for the bar exam, and you want to have the best shot you possibly can at passing. So But I'm pretty sure you need to contact them and make the request with the documentation and then see if they have the large print. But I have seen it in other things. Okay.
There was one more question in the chat. Sorry. So the person is asking if they provide accommodations for remote testing as they did during the pandemic.
I have not seen that. I have just seen, that they might do it only if I haven't seen it specifically that they've as an accommodation. I've seen it, during COVID, but whether they provide it as an accommodation, I'm not sure. You'd really have to check with that jurisdiction. I think it might be kind of tough, but you never know. The problem with the remote testing is, like I said, you have no hard copy, right, to take the exam. I think just if you don't need accommodations at all, it's still hard to take it without a hard copy. I don't know, maybe I'm old school, like kind of took the exam, like 100 years ago. But for me, I need the hard copy to scratch up and do the MPT and stuff like that if you're in a state that has an MPT. So, but certainly you can ask them. It really depends on your, it really just depends on your, on what you need. Anything else? Any other questions? Okay, are we good? Is anything in Q&A? Oh, here we go. If I'm denied accommodations, is our nonprofit or help service that law graduates can contact to get assistance with this process that you'd recommend reaching out to? I'm sorry, I don't know any nonprofit that does that type of work. Not personally. Have you seen any successful ADA challenges to a state with very restrictive standards? For example, the ADA says reasonable and limited to the need, the time determined nature of the disability, but it seems that having extensive clinical evaluations is more restrictive for applying for accommodations. Thoughts? I have not seen, I've seen people, like I said, I've seen people do appeals if they get denied, accommodations, like in their specific instance. But as far as I've done it, which is like over 20 years, yeah, clinical evaluations and diagnostics have been the norm, and that's what most jurisdictions have required. Well, thanks so much for joining us. I really hope that it's been helpful. We hope to be helpful for you in the future. And all the private tutors are great and have helped a lot of people in the past. Well, have a good evening. Thanks. Bye.
Hello, I am back, and I want to thank you so much, Lavanya, for giving us that presentation and for helping the students understand, helping our students understand the process they need to go through so that they can succeed. I can't tell you enough how important this will be to some students. I had a student myself, and I know Lavanya has had many more, but this person had been a successful business person for many years, had gone to law school somewhat later in life, and did well in law school and could not figure out why they weren't passing the bar exam after numerous attempts. And I found this to be a really highly intelligent student. And finally, they came to me and said, hey, I knew my kids had ADD, but then I got tested and boy, I have ADD out the wazoo. This was somebody, who in our generation, maybe we didn't have as much awareness of that, and anything by way of educational assistance with that, right? So we just learned how to cope. People of our generation who had ADD or other issues just learned how to work with it. The bar exam didn't let this student do that. But the very first time that person took the bar exam with appropriate accommodations, after getting all the testing and everything else, they passed. And that person's now a lawyer and doing what they wanted to do. So that can be you. Don't let this process discourage you. And Lavanya and the other tutors and I are here for you. If you have questions about BarMax, questions along the way, please do reach out to us. And gosh, I had those slides earlier. You can reach out to us through the website or the app, or just by making a good old-fashioned phone call to one of these numbers. We are very proud of the course and the courses that we offer. We're very proud of the tutors that work with us here, and we hope that here at BarMax, you will find what you need to meet your needs and help you achieve your dream of becoming a lawyer. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Bye-bye.